So I'm joined by Green Party candidate Simeon Hart. I will be asking Simeon the questions directly. Simeon is deaf, he's a British Sign Language user, so the voice you will hear is the voice of his interpreter, Mark Millington, but the answers are coming directly from Simeon himself. Firstly, Simeon, can you tell me your reasons for standing in this by-election?
Well, I stood for the general election. Received many nominations for Oldham, for Sutherland and for Rochdale, and sent those in. They all went in, and I was chosen. And so the skills and the experience that I bring obviously were enough for the post. That was a short. It was actually quite. It was only 2.5 weeks before the general election I was actually nominated and given that opportunity. And so at the time, my expectations were very small. And so at the end of that, I actually got 2% of the votes, and which was better than nothing. That was actually an achievement for me. But my aim was 5%. But 2%, in 2.5 weeks, I felt, was quite significant. And I got obviously that number of votes. Now I've been nominated again and selected. I was quite surprised. So it's really lovely to be able to be up in that position. Just showing that people have a belief in me. For Oldham, for West Rochdale, Green Party, obviously they all believe in me. It doesn't matter about my deafness. That's not the issue. It's me having the skills and the experience to bring to that, and hence I've been asked to stand again. And I have a good level of empathy with people. A lot of candidates often don't show that empathy. I've worked and had involvement in many different areas within education, the charity sector, mental health, the international development, and I've been involved across the board in each of those areas. And so I have a good insight on what people need for Oldham West, for vulnerable people, for the deprived, and for any disabled people, and any deaf people. But for me, I'm able to think about what support might be needed, and I can see so far that that's not up to standard. And I think that's why I've been asked to do that, and why I'd be the best lead on that.
Right. Is that the reason why you stood again for this by-election? Do you still feel that there is a lot more to offer for this town?
Yes, most definitely. One important aim that I have is to give people within the area, the focus on the Green Party and who we are. For the by-election, I'm hoping that at the moment we have the 2% minority, but I would like that to get up to 5%. And it doesn't really matter what that ends up being, but I will just want a greater awareness of who we are, what the Green Party stands for. When I'm canvassing in the area, it's really interesting to see that people have never heard of the Green Party. And so when I actually explain that we've been around longer than UKIP has, we actually have been around longer, but people still haven't heard of us, but that's the media. That's how much attention, how much coverage we get within media, and there's so much coverage around immigration, those sorts of issues, that I understand why UKIP does get that attention. But it's nice for people to understand who we are and what we can offer. And that's a real problem for us. And the media doesn't treat all parties fairly currently, and they like the big stories, don't they? And so they will be focusing on some of the other issues that might detract from us and who we are. So I'm really keen that people will be voting for us, for me, to bring fairness to the picture. And I know they've had Labour here for 45 years now, and it feels like it's time for a change. And at the same time, if they continue to vote for Labour, really we're not really learning anything for the area. Nothing's going to change, because there's a strong tradition of services being provided in the way they have been provided, and the Greens are quite key for change in the area. In Brighton, for example, Caroline Lucas, the MP, she won her seat in 2010, and there have been big changes now in Brighton, and also actually quite recently. This last 2010 to 2015, Caroline was voted for that 5-year period, and was given standing there because people saw how much change she brought, and there were new things being brought to the area. So it's really important that people in this area have an awareness of what we can do. because I feel that people are voting quite blindly for Labour at the moment because they're not actually aware who's behind that. They just know that people have always voted Labour, so they continue to. But we can bring a change to that.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about the changes you want to bring, and that this town has had a Labour MP for 45 years, as you rightly point out. What changes do you feel need to be made to Oldham? What do you know about Oldham that needs changing?
With Fox-Denton, there's
big issue,
huge problems there, and the environment's lovely, but I know they want to build so much, and so the lead roads, and think about the traffic implications there. There are real housing issues, but also the warehousing issues around there. The designs are just wrong, and that's a huge priority for us, and for the whole area really. And with the NHS. There are real issues there. Thinking about how much money the government is trying to save when it's focusing on the NHS, and that's going to have a real effect on people in this area for their well-being, and create real limitations for people living in the area. And with employment in this area, in Oldham, we're looking at the highest percentage of unemployment. And so that's a real issue for me to be focusing on at this time. And with the 627. We have the retail park there, don't we? And I actually, with the general election, I thought, okay, what I'm going to do, I'm not going to take an interpreter with me. I'm just going to go down. I'm just going to start going into places like McDonald's and the restaurants that are in that area, and just ask certain questions. And most of the workers that I found in those restaurants or retail units were coming in from outside the areas. They're coming from Middleton, from Rochdale, from Manchester. And not many of those people actually were from this area. And you're thinking, where are the opportunities then for people in this area? Why aren't they being given those opportunities? And so, and I think that might relate to the issues within education. And because whether people are not being given the same educational opportunities here, hence then not ending up in positions of employment. Obviously, we have a strong Asian community here, and I question whether the community is accessible for them and giving the same level of opportunities to them. Thinking about issues around language, around culture, around community, and giving real respect to them, and thinking about how we can be inclusive of them within our communities. For deaf people, specifically living in the area, accessibility is again a real key and a real issue for them. The council haven't made their services accessible for them. It's very poor. And with transport in the area, we do have the tram system. We have, and it's quite accessible because they have visual displays. But when it comes to things like educational and employment opportunities, we find that they're very poor. With Oldham College, they actually have deaf students in Oldham College. It's mixed. We have whether it's people who are deaf and hard of hearing or profoundly deaf and sign language. It's a mixed environment. But after they leave college and they then are seeking employment, that's when we see the barriers being encountered, because there aren't the employment opportunities for those deaf people. And for fracking, for example, that's for me is that. For me, that's about people making profit from a community, and it's the real consideration being given to the climate. In America, there are obviously a lot of fracking is taking place there, and the government have now realised that we're seeing more flooding there, we're seeing more environmental change on a negative level. And so, for example, when people are doing fracking in an area and they're then laying back the land, what they're not realising is the scarring effect of the land. Just as much scarring it affects people's bodies, it can affect land, and it can really have a negative, adverse problem on an area. And so we don't know the long-term effects of fracking, and so we really do need to be giving attention to that at this current time.
You mentioned there the difficulties facing deaf people within Oldham. I was wondering if you could tell me a bit about the challenges you face personally, particularly as someone that's standing for an MP. How difficult do you find it doing what you do with being a deaf person?
Well, there are two things there. Firstly, just the things I've gone through in my life throughout my career, generally being a BSL deaf person, BSL using a deaf person, and so I've faced many barriers throughout my life, and some of those I've been able to overcome and move on. Some of them I haven't been able to. And so within my life, I've got quite used to hitting barriers and having to face different ways of overcoming them. And it will be very different to different people. Some people struggle to get over certain barriers, but people are quite astonished at some of the things that I hit in life and what I have to go through. But that's just become a normal situation for me. I know when I've worked overseas, I worked in the Philippines, and there's real poverty there. We have it here, but so much more there because of the population. We're seeing, obviously, it's a greater population there, and we're seeing some of the barriers being encountered by sign language users there. So here we've got 50 to 70,000 BSL users in this country. We have a real stats, any founded stats here, but there are so many more in the Philippines. There's 1.5 million deaf people there, so many more. And that's because obviously the medical provision is different, and people get illnesses that lead to them developing deafness. And so when I think about my career, I've worked with computers, that's my background, and I actually gave up working in that sector because the barriers that I was facing often was blocked from being given promotions. I worked for one company, for example, for 4 years, and for the first 3 years I was kept in the same position. And I'd see all these new recruits come in, hearing recruits come into the company. They may have been there for 2 or 3 months, and they'd be promoted ahead of me. And often I would just be kept, in certain positions because of my deafness. And I just got to the point where I thought, I've had enough. I've had enough of seeing this happen. And when I spoke to my manager at the time, it was a horrible word for my manager to use at the time. It was very oppressive. He says, "You are immature." I said, "Sorry?" And he said I was immature, which was a real shock for me at the time. I said, "Can you tell me what you mean?" He said, "Well, you don't do overtime. You don't do you don't work with your teams." And there was all these things that I rattled off, which weren't true, by the way. I had to challenge those. I said, no. I've done all those things. I've worked weekends. I've done this. I've done that. And the manager at the time was really thrown by that, and he was quite bemused that these facts weren't actually true. And he brought in a colleague of mine, a really reliable colleague, and we wrote things down on paper, and he had a bit of gesture to help me with communication. And he basically just confirmed everything I was saying, and the manager was quite taken aback. And so I said, "Where are you getting this information from?" And he said, "Oh, from your line manager." But he just made up all these lies because he just didn't want me to get ahead. So the oppression in the workplace for me was terrible. And so I ended up leaving and moving into a charitable company, and moving into the arts world, going into teaching sign language, setting up a business. And so for me, if in that sector, in computing, I really could have worked well there. I could have made quite a career of that and earned quite a substantial amount. And that was a challenge for me to leave that and think, actually, I've lost out, and I've had to focus in different areas of my career. But the time I spent in the Philippines, that was the best 3 years of my life. And the reason for that is because I learned what poverty really means, and how people cope in the midst of adversity. And here, obviously, we have a benefit system that supports people in those situations, but there are no systems there supporting that level of poverty. And people are making do. People get by, and real poverty, but really happy people in the midst of that. And we have a culture here of moaning, don't we, about the government, and it's a very different culture that we face compared to what people in the Philippines have. But that aside, the reason I'm standing as an MP, for the last 400 years, the government, we look at how BSL has been treated. And we've never had a BSL user in government in the last 400 years, and so it's time for a change. The government needs to take responsibility for all members of society, for all people, whether that's just your regular person in the community, so someone who has an additional disability. And so there are laws that protect people from different races, ethnic backgrounds. People who are from different disabilities, but not really for deaf people. There's no real protection for deaf people in our society. And so for me, I just feel like if I'm able to influence that, I'm able to give a voice for deaf people. I'm sure you'll be aware of Jack Ashley. Jack Ashley. He was a hearing person, but lost his hearing over time and became deaf, and he ended up having a cochlear implant fitted. But I applaud him because the last few years of his time there before he retired, he realised there were real issues facing deaf people, and unfortunately that was just a few years he had before he actually came to the end of his career. But since then, since he's retired, things are quiet again in that area, and I know I've approached people about this issue, and people don't know really how to respond. And secondly, that ability to empathise with deaf people and the ability to represent them right. I think there's a real fear about saying the wrong thing on behalf of deaf people. And that's partly because deaf people themselves should be in government, should be the voice, not hearing people. And so, for me, if I'm able to bring that benefit for all people in Oldham, for deaf people, or for anyone, and so that's really key for me. And so if we can recognise the needs of the people in the Oldham area, we can have an influence nationally as well. So for me, I want to bring a change to this area, but to be a flagship for other areas too. In Scotland, you may be aware the BSL Act in Scotland was just passed in September, and it was given constitutionally, it was given recognition, legal recognition. BSL in Scotland, which again I applaud, and in England we haven't reached that stage yet. And the problem we've got is because we've got England and Wales, and we would love to see a BSL Act, so BSL England and Welsh Act, but it's who moves that on that. And so if I'm able to get into positions like that, to a position of power where I can bring influence around that, because we see that with Gaelic, don't we? We see the support, the financial support that's given to the language of Gaelic and language of Welsh people, but we don't see that with BSL. Cornwall even, the small numbers of people using Cornish, they've been given recognition for their language, but we have no money going towards the development of British Sign Language, and there are more BSL users than there are Gaelic users or Cornish speaking people, and so the needs of BSL users are being ignored. It's a language issue. But it's not a verbal language, and so I think for me, I want to raise the issue that we have visual language that deaf people use, and we're in the 21st century, and we need to be given recognition to the fact that we should have equality too around our language needs. The deaf community, in the deaf community, we see there's 4 times the prevalence of mental health issues compared to within the hearing community, and so the government are not helping that. Deaf people, whether it's within school or in other areas of life, what we're seeing is the way deaf people are being treated, the systems that are in place for deaf people, is actually creating an open door to the mental health system. I'm actually working in that sector at the moment in mental health, and I actually started last year working with people with mental health issues, and I wanted to see it for myself. And it had a real impact on me. It actually broke my heart. And so many of the people I'm working with are deaf, and I just had an event, or many events in their lives through oppression, that have caused them to have an onset of mental health, poor mental health. And so the government have imposed so many cuts. They wanted to save so much money, which is causing additional stresses and worries for people in the community. And so we're seeing that have a real adverse effect on people's mental health. So the government now is having to spend so much more money in the NHS to fight those issues. And so it's very short-sighted, because if they just put those into opportunities before somebody got to the point where it affected their mental health, they wouldn't have to put that long-term investment into improving their mental health. And so it actually is going to be more effective for the government to think about strategically why don't we work on prevention rather than treating people once they're in the mental health system, and the stress that causes to the NHS around primary care, but that's the government's issue.
You were mentioning about government cuts. Can you tell me a bit about your stance on the proposed cuts to working tax credits?
Good question. With working tax credits, it definitely needs reviewing. I don't think it should be cut at this point. Definitely not. It definitely needs reviewing. It's thinking about how we can work efficiently with that money. There are a lot of middle class people who are receiving tax credits, and even if their income is quite high, and we have to question what is the threshold for someone receiving those benefits. There are many people who are on very small amounts, living on small amounts, and we don't want to be bringing impact on those people's lives. Again, around the mental health issue, we don't want them to slip into depression, having breakdowns because they just can't cope financially. The government needs to give real thought to that, and maybe need to be giving more thought to the middle classes and about how much need there is for that group of people to be receiving benefits. And so I know that they've wanted to impose the cuts, but when moving through a feasibility study, we should be able to get to a point where we understand that more clearly. It's not about just imposing a cuts for cuts' sake. It's because I think that's going to have a real effect on the morale of people, and that feeling is there amongst the community. People do feel very negatively towards this, and so it's really nice to see the House of Lords say that they want it to be reviewed, and that was a real relief for me, because obviously we've got the upcoming budget where that will be announced, but we'll see what they say. And if I'm hoping they use common sense, the poor members of the community, they're not to blame. And it's for some of those, it's their upbringing, it's their educational opportunities that have led to them being in that place where they might need benefits to support them in their life. And so the government should be recognising those factors. And so for me, maybe more attention needs to be given on people earning higher amounts of money, and what the threshold should be. And more leniency given to people who are struggling more. And I don't think the government recognise that, because for us as Greens, we recognise that if we can increase the well-being of the poorer members of the community, we will see greater savings long term.
Tax credits is obviously a really big issue in Oldham at the moment, with 8,000 families due to be affected by cuts.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that is the biggest issue. If it's not, what's the biggest issue you've come across when talking to constituents whilst canvassing? What's been the biggest concern expressed to you?
When I've been canvassing in the area, we've been using a questionnaire, a 60-second questionnaire, and it's been quite surprising to see what people have said there. Policing is definitely an issue. People have said there are not enough members of the police force supporting the area. When it comes to issues of things like burglaries, just the increase of crime generally, people don't feel safe. That's a problem. So within the evenings, people are quite scared to go out in the evenings because we don't have many members of the police force supporting the area in the evenings. And so for break-ins, people might encounter a break-in and say, okay, they contact the police, but the police are responding saying that they're not able to come out because they're dealing with other matters. But it's difficult because when someone claims on their house insurance, they need to get a crime reference number, and they can't get that until a police officer has got involved, and so that's causing issues for members of our community. So yesterday, actually, the government said that there are still cuts afoot because obviously the terrorism that we've seen now in Paris. They're saying, regardless of that, we're still going to impose cuts on our system here, and that's scary. When we talk about cleaning the city up, for me, I think it was Coldhurst, and obviously a very strong Asian community, a lovely community actually, and I was quite shocked that looking at the fields, how dirty they were, how littered they were, which means that children can't play in those areas. When I look at how much has been dumped in that area, there are needles where people have used their needles for drugs. There are condoms that are there on those fields, and thinking, okay, well, what part has Labour played in this area to clean up those areas? this isn't about them. This is about the people. These areas need cleaning up. This is about providing a safe, clean area for children to play, and that's wrong. And again, that's an issue of well-being. Well-being is a real key issue for a community, and a real issue that will bring sustaining well-being to an area. And so, when we've got the happier countries, let's look at Denmark, for example. They're the top of that league. They would say they were the happiest country, and the reason for that, is because our government is so fixed on saving money. They're not really thinking about how happy people are, what their well-being is like. So in the Oldham area, talk about that 8,000 people being potentially affected by tax credits cuts. That's going to really have an effect on their morale. And who's there for them? Who's there tackling people's levels of well-being, levels of happiness?
You were talking about that you have been out canvassing and talking to people. What's the response been like towards yourself and towards the Green Party? Has it been positive?
A few people have been quite positive actually about Greens, but the majority just don't know who we are. And when I say, if you heard of the Green Party, they often say no, which takes me back really. And so I'll say, but I'll also ask them things like, do you know what the policies and the manifestos are of the Lib Dems, of Labour? And they again are saying no, which is interesting, isn't it? They're still voting for them, even though they don't know what their policies or manifestos are, And so people will be saying they're voting for UKIP, and I respect that. I respect that people have a choice about who they vote for. So this isn't a criticism of UKIP. But that's often because they're saying, oh, we like Nigel, he's a good-looking man, and they don't know what his manifesto is and what he stands for. It's really interesting, isn't it, that they just like the man. But people just don't realise, what we should be thinking about people's policies and what they stand for.
So lastly, Simeon, could you just tell me, or tell our readers really, why you think they should vote for you?
Well, what's important for me is for people in the community to realise that it's time for a change. And I think it's a bit of a wake-up call. The last 45 years, they've had Labour providing for them, and it's almost like a seat has been saved for Labour. And so for me, I look back over that 45 years and think there are probably achievements that have been put in place, but I don't see many. And so there are still large amounts of poverty, and a lot of disabled and deaf people finding that they don't have access to their own community. And so there are improvements that need to be made. I know the councillor here, there's a lot of support for Labour, but a lot of people from Labour in positions, and so we need to be thinking why, therefore, is our community still affected by having poor areas where things are still being dumped, like I mentioned earlier. And so like I said about that Foxton's area, think about there are still issues that haven't been addressed. Just issues around the traffic of the town, think about how that works, and so it's about asking people what they want. And they're the voters. It's their right to be heard, and so I feel like people have been acted on rather than for, and it should be the other way around. People should be heard. People should be responded to, which keeps people happy, And so people know they have a right to vote, and that's great. But they also need to know that what's important for them is things don't happen overnight. That we need people in place to progress things, to bring about that change, but people want to see that change come about. So for the next 4.5 years to the next general election, we obviously we had the general election in May, so 4.5 years worth now that we're facing. and the targets should be achievable and ones that will benefit the people. It's their right to see things change, and so that's why we want people to vote for us. We want to bring about that change. This we understand there are other parties that are keen to provide in this area to represent the people, but we feel like we can achieve so much more for them. And so, lastly, for me, this isn't about so for deaf people. This isn't about deaf people not being able to achieve anything. And it's having the right support in place and having the right communication, the right interpreters in place to make sure that people can achieve their ambitions. And so for the Greens in New Zealand, we currently have the Green Party in New Zealand, and they actually have the first deaf MP. They actually found their seat 2.5 years ago. Family deaf, and this is lady. She was born here actually, which is interesting. She emigrated, married someone from that area, and became their MP, one of the MPs there. And when they became the MP, the government refused to provide any communication support for her. And what happened in the end was her team challenged this in the High Court. And at the end, the government backed down and put the money in place to support her with her communication. So, last 2.5 years, she's actually done really well because that recognition has been given. And that's what we should have here. That's what I should have here. And so in South Africa, we actually have one deaf MP. And within the European Parliament, we have two deaf MEPs. One of them is from Belgium and one from Hungary. And so they've been in place for a while actually now, and one of them's just been given their second term as an MEP. The person from Belgium was voted in was earlier this year in 2015. This deaf person was put in place, and so thinking, what's happening here in Britain? Why are we not in that position? And we were one of the leaders of the world when it came to certain issues, and I think for us, we've slipped back. It is time for change.